What's up, people? Just a quick overview of our new language topic in stage 22, which is perfect active participles in a nutshell. Whereas the challenge in stage 21 was distinguishing present active participles from stage 20 from perfect passive participles. The challenge in stage 22 becomes distinguishing not only those, but also perfect active participles from perfect passive participles. And what makes perfect active participles tricky is the fact that they're identical twins with the passive ones, all right? You can't really look at a perfect active participle and say, oh, that's different from a perfect passive. They will look generally identical, but there are some contextual and vocabulary-based ways of distinguishing one from the other, which we'll practice throughout the stage, and you'll be accountable for going forward. But let's go through the notes, and I'll give you some examples from the book whenever appropriate. Perfect active participles are very similar to perfect passive participles, so they're still participles. They're still verbal adjectives, meaning that their actions, which essentially describe nouns. They're perfect, which means that the action is completed before the other action. All right. Remember when we said perfect passive and having been whatevered, that action always happened before the other action in the sentence. Cephalus, terrified by memoir, quickly left the room. He was terrified first, and then he left the room. So one action was completed before the other. And when it's a perfect participle, that action happened before the other action in the sentence. But because perfect active participles are active, the nouns they modify will be doing the action. So a passive participle means that the word it refers to is receiving the action, like in the sentence I just said. Cephalus, terrified by memoir. Terrified, perteritus, refers to Cephalus. And he's not the one terrifying anybody. He's being terrified. But perfect active participles change that. And on pages 22 and 23, the model sentences, you see how this works a little bit differently. So an example is in number 2. It says, for senem conspicatus post columnam se calao. It says, the thief, having caught sight of the old man, hid himself behind a column. So here, the perfect passive participle or perfect active participle is conspicatus. Notice, perteritus, conspicatus. One's passive and one's active. You can't just look at it and tell the difference. But conspicatus is just kind of naturally a perfect active participle, and it refers to the thief. Again, it says the thief having caught sight of the old man. It doesn't say that the thief was caught sight of or was noticed. It's referring to the thief, but the thief is doing the catching sight of. As you see there, because of that, it's an active participle. So difference between active and passive is important for the meaning of these participles as opposed to those we saw in stage 21. Perfect active participles are translated having whatever in English. Again, just illustrating that difference. Perteritus, perfect passive, was having been terrified by memoir. Here, conspicatus, still with that T, is having caught sight of, in this case, the old man. All right, notice the difference between having and having been. In Latin, perfect active participles often have T or SS before first and second declension endings. Sound familiar? It's the same way we identified perfect passive participles, all right? 90% or 95% or whatever of the verbs we'll see will have a T. 90 or of the other 5%, about 4 of them, 4% will have a double S, and like 1% will have a single S for our purposes. But again, this is what I mean by they're identical twins, is it's the exact same description of how to identify perfect passive participles. All right, for example, ingressus, adeptus, conspicatus. What's different about ingressus with the double S from usus with the double S, which is passive? Adeptus from laudatus, conspicatus from perteritus. All right, you can't look at a perfect participle and distinguish whether it's active or passive. And so I give you this little NB. Only a small group of verbs have perfect active participles. Most have only passive ones. And that's the thing. We don't really get into, and the book doesn't really get into what kinds of verbs and more of the nitty gritty of it. But at the end of the day, there's a list. Okay, and you're going to hear me say this quite a bit throughout stage 22. We're going to make a list of the words that are perfect active, and everything else is perfect passive. So when I ask you why a particular participle is perfect active, okay, you're going to tell me it's on the list. It's just one of those in the small group of verbs that have an active and not a passive perfect participle. And as I say here again, there's really no easy way to tell which ones do and which ones don't, besides context or whether they're on the list or not. One of the things that you can use contextually is, rather than having by someone, where that arab means by with a perfect passive participle, they often take direct objects. They often have accusative forms. For example, precatus. Again, it's a perfect active participle. You can't distinguish this from a perfect passive. It still has the T before an ending. But if maybe you don't know that precatus is just active and not passive naturally, use the context here. All right. Senex deam precatus says the old man having prayed, to the goddess. The next one, the thief senem conspicatus, the thief having caught sight of the old man, from the model sentence I referenced earlier. All right. Notice that they're accompanied by accusatives. Only active voice verbs can have an accusative direct object. Only passive verbs, like perfect passive participles, can have arab, meaning by. So while it's not 100% effective, while it's not going to work 100% of the time, if you see in that little participle phrase like deam precatus, senem conspicatus, that there is just an accusative, it probably is going to be active. If you see arab, meaning by, it's probably going to be passive. So we're going to practice this quite a bit. We're going to generate the list of the words that are just perfect active and move on with our lives, or we can get used to context here, which doesn't work all the time, but it'll work for our purposes and for what we're going to see with these in our stories.